Mary, where were we?
We had done
Some of the joys and concerns, okay. You'll have to catch me up on those because I promised I would pass those on to Pastor Blake this week. So, did we do call to worship already?
We did everything except the sermon. We read everything.
Scripture readings?
All the readings.
You even managed to find Wisdom of Solomon.
Yes, but there were two verses. Chapter 2, 23 and 24.
You didn't do Wisdom of Solomon. Did you do it out of that Bible there? You did Song of Solomon, didn't you? I cheated today. That's from the Apocrypha. That's all right. I caught him at center too. I'll read that because that's in the unabridged version of the Bible. I'm a little tricksy today there. All right, so we'll pick it up there then, huh? But you did Corinthians? Second? Okay. All right. Perfect. So all I need to do is catch us up with Wisdom of Solomon and then actually preach. Perfect. Now I know where I am. Who am I? Oh. All right, so our deuterocanonical reading today, since I threw you a curveball, comes from the Wisdom of Solomon, chapter 1, verses 13 through 15, and chapter 2, verses 23 through 24. God did not make death, and he does not delight in the death of the living. For he created all things so that they might exist. The generative forces of the world are wholesome, and there is no destructive poison in them, and the dominion of Hades is not on earth. For righteousness is immortal. For God created us for incorruption, and made us in the image of his own eternity. But through the devil's envy, death entered the world, and those who belong to his company experience it. May the Lord add his blessing to the reading, the hearing, and the understanding of this, his holy word. I threw that deuterocanonical lesson in there not to be tricky. I didn't really like the lectionary Old Testament reading today. It was about the death of Jonathan, and I thought, no, that just didn't sort of fit. But I liked the lectionary reading from the Deuterocanon because it sets the perfect tone for us to understand both our gospel and epistle lessons today. So what we hear there in that passage from Wisdom of Solomon is a very, very clear-cut expression of what it is that God intends for us. God specifically made us in his image to be his companions for all eternity. Death was never meant for us. And it's because of that Christ came, that God became incarnate as Jesus Christ and sacrificed himself on the cross to win us away from death. Because we have always been meant for eternity. I have always liked the traditional English translation of the Apostles' Creed, where it says that we believe in life everlasting, versus the more modern English translation that says life eternal. I don't like that translation because life eternal seems to imply that our life here stops and then a new life begins that lasts forever. But the original sense, which I think everlasting captures better, is that the life that we lead now continues into eternity. We have this bad habit of thinking of our mortal death as an end point. Our life here ends, and a life there begins. It's even in our language when we say the afterlife. I don't like it that. That's not accurate. Our life goes on. Death doesn't mark an end. Our mortal death is merely a transition. It's the same as, when you're walking through your house and you go from one room in through a doorway into another, you don't turn into a different person. You might not always remember what you went into the other room for. That happens. But you don't become a different person when you enter that other room. You continue on. You've merely passed a threshold. We, and all that we do, God intends for eternity. There is meant to be continuity. That thought should inform the way we read today's gospel. In today's gospel reading, Jesus is there amongst the crowds that are pressing in, and there is a leader of the synagogue named Jairus, and his daughter has come down with a fever. Now, we nowadays don't always have the same kind of impression of a fever that they would have at that time, because we live in an age of modern medicine, and fevers are something that we can control, that we can get down, and people will survive. But at the time of Jesus, if someone came down with a fever, that was a desperate situation, particularly with children. Fever could rapidly get out of control and lead to death. If a parent had a child that came down with a fever, they were in desperate, dire straits. And that's the situation that Jairus faces. And Jesus' reputation as a healer has spread far and wide. Jesus' reputation in general has spread far and wide. That's why there are so many people crowding around him. And Jairus comes to Jesus and he says, "My daughter has a fever. She's near death. Can you save her?" And Jesus said, "Of course." And they start to make their way to Jairus' house, but the crowds begin to press in and impede the way. And in particular, there is a woman who approaches Jesus who has been suffering from some sort of hemorrhagic disease, some bleeding disorder. We don't know what in particular, but it's something that has been plaguing her for quite some time and has been thus far untreatable, and she is in a similar desperate state. She comes to Jesus in great faith. She thinks to herself, "I'm not going to bother him. He's important. He's busy. I won't bother him. If I can just touch his clothes, I just know. I have faith. I believe I'll be healed." And she does so. She reaches out and she grabs the hem of his cloak. Now, one of the things about Jesus is by nature of his divinity, he is imbued with the Holy Spirit, which has that power and activity. The healings that Jesus performs come through the power of that Holy Spirit, and Jesus senses that Spirit pouring out into this woman as she just merely touches his clothes. And he says, Who touched me? He feels that power move. And of course, with these crowds pressing in, the disciples say, "Anybody could have touched you." No, who touched you? It's a big crowd, who knows? But this woman, when she sees Jesus have that realization, she's a little bit taken aback. She's a little bit frightened, in fact. Ooh, have I done something really bad? To be healed, I touched you. And Jesus turns to her and he says, "It is because of your faith that you have been healed." It's faith that is always the operative component here. It is that faith, that deeply held belief that enables the Spirit to flow and have that activity. That's important for us to remember. Nothing more than mere touch of cloth, and yet faith caused the power to flow. It's that same faith that brought Jairus to Jesus to begin with. And just after this woman is healed, Jairus' servants approach with the terrible news that his daughter has indeed died. And they said, well, don't bother him anymore. It's pointless now. There's a little bit of a wavering of faith there, isn't there? And Jesus turns to them and he says, she has not died. She's asleep. Now, I want to make something very abundantly clear here. This is not a matter of a mistake has been made. It's not that the girl has fallen asleep and they've just mistaken it for death. She really has died. And Jesus understands that she has died also. The difference is that Jesus in his divinity has a very different perspective on what death means. Jesus has that divine perspective on death that we see expressed in that passage that I used from the Wisdom of Solomon today. That we are meant for eternity. That death is not what God intends for us. And it is for that purpose that Jesus came to bring salvation. Jesus understands that for us, mortal life is not meant to be an end, but is meant to be simply a transition. And so Jesus proceeds on to Jairus' house along with a select few disciples. And they enter the house, and Jesus takes the girl's hand and he says, Talitha kum. Little girl, arise. And she gets up. She is indeed restored to life, real biological living. This is evidenced by the fact that he says, well, give her something to eat. You know, you come to life, you're hungry. We see that later on with Jesus' own resurrection, right? One of the resurrection appearances with the disciples, he says, I'm hungry, do you have anything to eat? And they give him fish. Right? Living things need to eat. Now, I've mentioned before in sermons that when we see little throwaway details of the story that don't seem to add anything to the narrative, that those are generally indicators of historical truth and accuracy. Well, in this and that's usually that's in the Gospel of John that we see those popping up. But we see this here in this passage from Mark. There's a little parenthetical statement after Jesus says, Talitha kum, and the girl gets up. There's a little parenthetical statement that says that she was 12 years old. Okay. So, seeming throwaway comment. Now, first of all, there it is. There's our throwaway detail. That's how I know that this story is historical. This isn't a myth. This isn't a fable. This isn't legend. It's not made up. This girl was dead. Jesus brought her back to life. That's in the history book. That's an historical event because we've got this little inclusion of a detail. But in this particular instance, I think there is something else deeper that comes out from that. She's 12. Now, 12 years old doesn't really sort of jangle any bells for us as 21st century American Christians, does it? Okay, 12. So what? 12. But that would have been a very significant age at that time. 12 years old is the age at which children in the Israelite community would undergo the ritual of either bar mitzvah or bat mitzvah, depending on gender, where they are considered full-fledged adults, responsible for themselves, at least responsible for their own spiritual state, that they become full members of the worshiping community, they become members of the synagogue, and they are now part of the worship in the temple community. It's their entry into adulthood. We continue this sort of tradition in the Christian church. In the United Methodist Church, generally speaking, we confirm our youth at around age 12. They become full-fledged members of the United Methodist Church upon confirmation at around age 12. This is not something new that we do. This is not a break. This is a continuation of that ancient bar mitzvah practice. There's continuity here between synagogue and church. We have not invented something novel. Now, one of the things that I always find is a real fun little detail of this, just as upon bar mitzvah or bat mitzvah, a Hebrew child becomes a full-fledged member in the eyes of the worshiping community, an adult, so too when we confirm a child in the United Methodist Church as a full member, they become an adult and can take on all the responsibilities too. And I always get a kick out of it. I've very rarely seen it. It does happen, but it's rare. As soon as they're confirmed, they're eligible to serve on any position, on any committee in the church, even chair. I would just love just once, to make a 12-year-old the chair of church council, just to see how it goes. Steve's like, why not? I said, it's rare that happens, but I have seen 12 and 13-year-olds serve on committees in churches. In fact, I was one. Back in my home church, way back when I was 13 years old, I was on what way back then was Council on Ministries. It does happen. And believe me, the church burned down before I was in that position. Okay. But there is something of symbolic significance here with that age and Jairus' daughter. Because this raising from the dead, there's this transition from an immature childhood into mature responsibility. Her life didn't end and begin again. Her life has continuity, but it advances into new and important things. That's a message that we should keep in mind when we turn to our epistle lesson today. Paul is once again addressing the church at Corinth, that church that gives him such heartburn. The thing about Corinth, and Mary, I believe you've been to Corinth, haven't you? Right? At the time, Corinth was a very wealthy city, a very important city. It was a trade city. It sat on some crossroads of some major trading routes in the Roman Empire. It was an important, very wealthy, somewhat powerful city within the empire. And because of its position as a trading city, people from all corners of what was then the known world gathered there. All different nationalities, languages, races, religions. It was very much a mixing pot. There was a lot of diversity in Corinth. Some of that is even reflected in Corinthian architecture. Mary, you've seen on your trips Corinthian columns, right? Out of all of the architecture in Greece, isn't Corinthian architecture the fanciest stuff? All the little flowers carved in at the tops of the columns and everything. Corinth really had to show off. All of that brought together, combined, all that diversity of people combined with the wealth, the church at Corinth had great potential. Potential to do fantastic ministry if they could just manage to get out of their own way. One of the things about the Church of Corinth is because there was so much diversity brought together, they had a tendency to grind their gears with each other. They didn't always see eye to eye because of all the different cultures and backgrounds that were brought together. And because they didn't always see eye to eye, it led to friction. And there was often infighting in that church at Corinth. And it's what got in the way of doing ministry. They had all the resources, they had all the potential, they had all the people, all the wealth, everything they needed. And that was the thing that Paul tried to point out to them. Notice that passage that we read today from Corinthians starts out with another one of Paul's laundry lists. Except in this particular case, Paul is listing all of the gifts that God has given the church at Corinth for ministry. These are all the things that you have to do ministry. And Corinth couldn't get their act together sometimes because they were so busy stumbling over one another. And what they would do is they would always beg Paul, come back and fix it. And you started the church and then you left. Well, come back and fix it. We want to do all this stuff, but we need you to do it. Come back and fix it. And Paul made it very clear to them that not only couldn't he wouldn't come back and fix it. He said to them, you have stated a desire to do great things. You've even gotten started on some of them. Would you just finish the job? I mean, he literally says that. Finish the job. Finish the work. He says to them, you don't need me to come back. I have left you with good leaders. Trust in them. Trust the leadership that you have there. Trust one another. Learn to live in that mutual love that Christ calls us to. See beyond your differences to all of the unique gifts that you bring. And when you do that, you won't need me anymore. You won't even want to call me. You've started the work. Finish the job. You have everything you need. It's part of that continuity. See, God has always intended for all of us, both individually and collectively as the church, for eternity. All of the work that the church does is meant for eternity. That brings us to this moment. It's a time of transition. It's tempting for us to think of this as an end. And then next week, a beginning. But that's not quite accurate. You know, in the United Methodist Church, pastors come, pastors go. It's been that way from the start. That's how we do it in the Methodist Church. That's how it's always been in Methodism, from way back in the 1700s. First of all, it was a practical matter, especially in colonial America with the circuit riders. It just had to be that way. Pastors come, pastors go. And some people say that that's a weakness in our system. I'm not so sure. I think that might be one of our strengths. For one thing, you're never without a pastor. You know, I feel bad sometimes for Presbyterians. You know, with their call system, you know, sometimes they can go for years without a pastor. I shouldn't say it's too much on camera, but didn't that just happen down the road a few years ago, right? They were without a pastor for quite some time. And never tick, Midnight, Matt Blake is your pastor. You're never without a pastor. Never. Because you don't need us fouling up the works. The thing that is the strength of